there's a lot going on, and as we're recording this, there's another, what would you call it?
Schism, almost. I mean,
is it schism?
It's not a schism, but it's definitely a division.
Schism's a technical thing.
It's a technical thing. It's more of a division. But
I don't think it's not a schism.
It's more of a preference that people who.
So recap for people so they know where.
Yeah, I mean, so this has been going on for years and years since Vatican II. It's like the people after Vatican II. There's the more traditional people who love the traditional Latin Mass, and there's the other side with the Novus Ordo. But when you actually read the documents of Vatican II,
Novus Ordo is just what you would experience at your
normal
Catholic
church. And the problem is that the Pope and the Congregation of Faith, that they're cracking down on the TLM. They want it to go away. They think that Mass is the dividing of people, which I couldn't, I think that's ridiculous. It's like, we want diversity within the church, but it's fine. How is that dividing people if everyone comes from different countries, everyone is worshiping God? Like, they worship different in Africa, they worship different everywhere. I think it's a beautiful thing. I don't think by people who want to worship that way is taking away from the way that you worship over here or your preferences. Not that one is any more valid than the other, but the traditional Latin Mass has been going on for 1,000 years. It's like, that's the way that's always been done. But there are some people who think that that's the only way. I think that's where we get in trouble. Yeah. Our faith is more of a both and. We can worship the one way, but when one side is getting cracked down on and people feel like they're being targeted, or, there's a lot of places you can't even have the traditional Latin Mass anymore. So people get really defensive when people get attacked. Then people really, they go on the offensive, or they go on the defensive, or they retreat into tribes. And that's what seems to be going on, especially with, the more and more that the Pope is, cracking down on people doing the TLM. So there's lines being drawn in the sand between the people who are, Vigano, who is, a traditional guy who's now been excommunicated, and he's, saying, going to the extremes to where the Pope isn't even legitimate, which is, this is where it leads. When you create these divisions within the church, it's only going to end up one place. It's going to be, you're in your camp and you're on your camp, and then there's going to be shots fired back and forth, and then it's going to get to the extremes, instead of, like, we can all admit and be in the middle somewhere, and to see the benefit of each other, instead of seeing each other as, well, you're messing up the unity of the church, you're not even legitimate. It's like, it just barrels and just goes crazy. But there's division is the opposite of what we talked about with Jesus. He wants us to be one. This goes back to what we said about in the people outside the church watching what's going on within the church. Is like, well, why do I already have a dysfunctional family at home? Why do I want to get into this dysfunctional family? You guys can't even get along yourself.
Yeah, it seems to me like, as I'm watching this unfold with Vigano and with Pope Francis, and what's going on in the Vatican versus what's going on with different groups in the church, and it's spilling into, like, people on X and on social media, that everybody's taking a stance. Yeah. They're picking their tribe. I saw a post just recently. I stand with Vigano. Against who?
Yeah.
You're standing with him against who? And so it's like, it reminds me of the account that Paul had. Like, you don't get to pick Paul's side versus Peter's side versus Apollo's side versus, it's like, who are we all? We preach Jesus Christ and Christ crucified. That's where our focus should be. All this stuff, and I humbly say, even to our leaders, like, the hyper focus on this stuff is detracting from our commission,
the core message,
and the core mission, not just message, the core mission that we have to disciple the world. I saw a quote from Father Dennis Fahey, Irish priest, 1800s, and I loved it. He goes, God wants one church and many nations. Satan wants many religions and one nation. This idea being that he wants to exert control, and in that control sow confusion, many religions. God wants many nations, right? There's many tribes of people. We all relate, and we have different ethnicities and cultural variety, and God, I think he delights in that variety. That's why we are who we are. And we should celebrate who we are. But it's one nation, it's one religion, it's one church that unites us. And that's Jesus at the head. And so the more we focus on these squabbles, the more disjointed and disunited we become. And so, I don't know, it's almost like you want to be able to just hit pause on the game and like what is it that we're actually doing?
Yeah.
How many people have you brought to Jesus?
Yeah.
How many people have you kind of brought into the church? How many people have you helped sow the seeds for encounter of the Holy Spirit? That's what matters. None of this other stuff matters.
Yeah.
And shame on us for focusing on that other stuff. Now you could have the conversation, well, we have to weed out the men that are sowing this division, and that's what this conflict is about. Well, I'm sorry. Who's going to take up arms against the Holy Father? Who's going to take up arms against the CDF? Or who's going to take, like, none of that is going to lead anywhere good. And so you as a Catholic, like, don't go on social media and just take a stand in the culture war, because that's not going to help anybody. Yeah. That's going to turn off the seekers. That's not helping anybody draw closer to Jesus.
Well, to play devil's advocate just a little bit is just that, the way there's a lot of saints though who caused division and they became saints. Sometimes God does use division to bring about unity. Sometimes a grain of wheat has to die to bring much fruit.
I don't think saints cause division.
Well, like Maximus the Confessor, the church literally cut his tongue out, exiled him. He became a saint. Like, because he went against.
Saints don't cause division though.
No, he brings a light to something that's going on within the church. At the time, he would have looked like a heretic, or he would have been causing division because he was going against what the bishops and what the Pope is saying at the time, because he was questioning what's going on. But he became a saint. God uses pagans. God uses people outside the church to bring people back to the core message. And I think a lot of people, especially on the right of this conversation, think that how come I'm always the one that has to say nothing and do nothing when we're being attacked constantly? Like, no one's going after Father James Martin. No one's going after, no one's excommunicating pedophiles. No one's excommunicating people who've caused serious harm to the church. But Vigano got excommunicated like in a second when these people, like, evidence on evidence and evidence of all this bad stuff they're doing, but no one's going after them. And it feels like no one has a voice for the people on one side, and only one side is being attacked. The other side's like, well, what about this? And it's like, it doesn't seem fair. So eventually people are like, well, this isn't fair. And same with the politics. It's like, well, it seems like one side of the political aisle gets attacked and gets sued or gets felonies or this, and the other side can do whatever they want. It's like, at which point, why does the people who are more conservative or traditional have to always take it on the chin? Why do we always have to sit back and be the unifiers when we're just being attacked? Like, at what point do people feel like their voice has to be heard? It may be division, but maybe division helps bring about eventually a unity, because it's like if we do nothing, then what's going to happen? If people don't fight back against, like, to say things that are, sometimes, we have to admonish the sinner. And that looks like we need to be all loving. It's like, well, no, this is sinful. Like, the behavior that you're engaged in, that's one of the works of mercy, is to admonish the sinner. But it seems like I'm being mean. Well, when you're teaching stuff that's antithetical to what the church teaches, I'm ultimately maybe alienating some people, but ultimately, am I leading them in truth and love? Am I doing it in a way that how Jesus would do? It's like, he didn't let people just keep going on and on and on. Sometimes people have to get involved, but it looks bad. It looks like division. It looks like we can't get along. But, Jesus himself said, I came to bring the sword. I'm going to put people against each other, because it's necessary sometimes, because you're doing what you're supposed to be doing. You need to do what my will is. And sometimes that looks like it's conflict and division, but is he using those divisions and these different people to bring about a greater unity? That's the hard part to decide. It's like, who says that every time I have to turn my cheek? Every time, but they can keep doing the things, I have to always take it on the chin? When do they take it on the chin? When do they take an L? When is anyone ever going to put someone and say, hey, you know what? You can't bless a couple that's homosexual. You can bless them individual, but they're coming into your church and you're blessing their union, and there's no repercussions. He hasn't been disciplined. You didn't see anything. It's like, that's scandalizing the church. So it's like, well, eventually people how come you're attacking this person but never say anything here publicly? Like, there seems to be a discrepancy on how the weight of justice is, and then people feel disenfranchised, and then people act out, and then it just gets worse. So it's like there has to be a fair back and forth between where it doesn't seem it's political or it doesn't seem it's tribal. It's just, this is what the truth is, and we're going to go after it the same way for everybody, versus I prefer this, therefore I'm going to punish these people we're not going to do anything about. That's the way this seems the world. That's how we get caught in these people feel like they're disenfranchised. And that goes not just in religion, politics, our jobs, or different things like that. But Sorry, went on my little rant there, but
I loved it. I got to receive all that.
yeah, but
You
it's just
said a lot. Here's what I got to say to you, okay? Because I appreciate that you're playing devil's advocate. So I'm going to take it easy on you.
All right, good.
Who said you keep turning your cheek, Jesus, right? You turn your cheek 7 times, 77 times.
That's forgive them, not turn your cheek. He said,
No, he said turn your cheek.
Yeah,
How many times do you turn? 7 times 77. We always turn our cheek. And it's Jesus is the one that brings the sword, right?
Yeah.
So this idea that saints divide, I think that's I appreciate the imagery, but it's simplistic in its presentation.
Yeah.
And here's what I mean. Saint Francis, used Saint Maximilian the Confessor. Saint Francis, Saint Catherine of Siena. There are all these powerful figures in our church's history who had to call the church back from excesses at one point or another. Saint Francis himself was commissioned by God through private revelation to help rebuild the church. Saint Catherine of Siena called the Pope back from France to Italy, to Rome. And so you do need those figures, and God does call them from time to time. But what do they do? And here's what I'm seeing that's different. What's happening now is it's a further delving into and a weeding into political issues. What Francis and Catherine did and what we ought to be doing, and the sword that Jesus wants us to use that divides, is a constant calling back to himself, to right worship, to right practice, to right relationship. And I'm not seeing that right now. I'm seeing, whether it's leaders or those who follow them, those who say, I'm going to stand with this guy or another, they're happy to weed into the political side of the conversation. What I want to do is be able to, and in whatever way that I can, if you're a lover of the traditional Latin Mass, or if you're one who finds fruit and fulfillment in the Novus Ordo, which is your typical Sunday experience, your Sunday Mass, then how has that transformed your life so much so that you become an icon of Jesus Christ? And how many people have you introduced to Jesus? How many people have you brought back to Jesus? That's what I want our leaders to be focused on. I don't want to see the Holy Father and the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith and the bishops that align with him taking sides, and then Vigano and the bishops, the conservative bishops that align with him, taking sides and further entering into these political conversations, absent from calling people back into right relationship with Christ. Like, how fruitful is your faith, Catholic? That's what's important. It's not what's going on with, this scandal, or what's going on with McCarrick, or what's going on with this cardinal, or what's going on with that. I can care less about. And you're right, that's happening. And that's always going to happen, because you said it yourself at the outset, we're hypocrites to a certain extent, because our goals and our ideals are loftier than our fallen nature is able to fulfill. That doesn't mean we continue to strive after them. Pope Francis himself says we're a church we're a church for the sick, right? We're a hospital for the sick. So we're never going to get away from them. But it's like, it's becoming too polarizing, and it's spilling out so much so that it's further tainting the church's ability to be a legitimate voice, to call people away from the excesses of the world.
But when it comes from the top, that's where it gets confusing. Just his last address.
That's the challenge to the top.
He has most of the sway though.
So here's the challenge. It's not it's not a pushback on the Holy Father that is devoid from Jesus. So I'll give you an example. The Holy Father wrote Laudato Si, which is and it was very controversial in some circles because it felt like an
attack on capitalism.
An attack on capitalism. Thank you very much. And he wrote a second follow-up letter. And that was further, it felt like more of a political document than it was a theological or spiritual expose on what it means to be stewards of creation.
Yeah, because the other popes have also written on the environment.
Exactly.
John Paul II, Benedict, they both.
So the criticism ought to be like, Holy Father, you're giving us this teaching. Where's Christ in this teaching? Where's Jesus in this teaching?
Yes.
Where's my ability as a Catholic to live my faith in relation to creation in this teaching? That's the pushback. We're not seeing that happen on that level. We're seeing people push back, and in the pushback, they're claiming, well, he's not a legitimate pope. Yeah. Again, that's what I'm saying. It's not helpful.
It's too far.
Yeah, it's not just too far. It's unhelpful and an illegitimate claim. But we're seeing this pushback on I'll give you another example. This pushback on the Latin Mass. So you've got people who, in response to the pushback on the Latin Mass, want to say the Second Vatican Council is illegitimate.
Yeah.
You're trying to tell me one of the largest ecumenical councils, the gatherings of the bishops from across the world and across Catholic Catholic rites, that's not legitimate? It's an excess. The pushback ought to always be, and this is what the saints do, they don't divide. They're more like a surgeon who cuts to heal.
Yeah.
It's always bringing us back to Jesus and right relationship and right practice with him. We need more of that.
Yeah.